The topic of the presentation today is psilocybernetic intents and the emergence of institutional neuroplasticity. Credit to Exent for stimulating this combination of topics. Intents, for anyone who doesn't know, is kind of this new interest area in the Web3 space with ANOMA and kind of this ability to embed desire gradients into our coordination systems, but we'll get into that in the talk here. So first of all, what the heck is psilocybernetics? So everyone's probably heard of psilocybin. This is a naturally occurring psychedelic compound that regrows neural pathways, among other miracles, through the process of neurogenesis. Cybernetics being the science of collective steering and communication within organizations. So psilocybernetics, the portmanteau, that is the responsive emergent institutional design using myco-phi tools and technology. And of course, myco-phi is an open exploration into mycelial patterns, how they can be applied to the economic, the democratic, and the computational substrates of digital public infrastructure. A couple of links, they're just at the bottom if anybody wants to check. I've kind of been building some rabbit holes over the past couple of weeks with AI's help. So there's a lot of interesting sort of websites and concepts floating around out there at the moment. A quick background, I probably don't need to tell this crowd, but why psilocybin? Psilocybin is this miraculous compound that exists in nature. But I thought actually psychedelia was really interesting because what it means is the manifestation of the self, the psychedelia. And we come from fungi. We are, fungi are our ancestors. They're among the oldest life forms on Earth. And mammals made, certain decisions to separate from, we eat food and digest it in our body. Mushrooms put their body in the food. So there are very, key distinctions, but I think there's a lot we can learn. And I think a lot of the problems that we have are the problems that we created because we are not thinking in the way that nature thinks. And if we can learn, if we can humble ourselves and listen to, these little messengers under our feet, perhaps we have a lot to learn. Cybernetics is basically a funny joke from Zargham from block science. It's the worst method for managing complex systems except for every other way. So cybernetics is, the emergent steering of complexity. Of course, that job is never done, but it can always get better. So I think there's an interesting application of, engineering and design science that can make methodical steps towards the better understanding and regulation of these kinds of organizational flows. So a bit of a sidetrack over to intents. Intents on a NOMA network are like broadcasting your needs in a network. And then the network kind of emergently resolves to address that need. So we can kind of, and that could be anything. That could be, I would like a pizza. That could be, I need a travel route planned for me to my next meeting. I might need van repair. All of these might be intents that can be broadcast to a network. And then the network can emergently route the resources from where they are to where they need to be to collect an incentive. So if we think about intents differently, perhaps intents, they create internal entropy, so unmet desires. And I'm not sure if I'm correct on all of this terminology, so this is just ideas being thrown out there. Unmet desires in the network or intents that are broadcast introduce an internal entropy in the network, which, in some sense makes the network uncomfortable. There are solvers that are stigmergically incentivized to address those unmet desires, to close that free energy, to reduce the internal entropy of the ecosystem back towards this dynamic equilibrium where needs are met. And equilibrium, maybe not the right term, but ultimately what we're trying to do here is leverage stigmergic response. A lot of the, a lot of nature's patterns follow stigmergic response. It's basically when an environmental cue points the way rather than a person or another messaging agent. So, we have these all over the place. A path in the woods is stigmergic. It's where everyone walked before, even a sign pointing the way. Ants follow pheromone trails. White blood cells follow cytokine signals. So these are all environmental cues that allow for the kind of emergent complexity to evolve off of simple behaviors. So the question here is, can intents introduce this stigmergic productive entropy into networks of collaborators? Is this ways that we can like route the needs of networks in different ways that open it up beyond sort of like small team central planning? You know, we have, and in a lot of groups today, you know, even in DAOs, it comes down to a small handful of people making decisions. Are they making the right decisions? How do we open up those decisions to the network of solvers that can perhaps be more not just seeing a broader picture, but also thinking outside the box in different ways that a small group that happens to be at the table may be thinking. So it's curious to think how we can kind of like myceliate this kind of decision making and sourcing the emergent solutions that the network might see that we as individuals don't. Also interesting to consider a lot of Will Ruddock's work with commitment pools. Amazing stuff. If you haven't looked into it yet, there's a link at the bottom. But these are great because commitment pools are where you put your obligations, your commitments. But the other side of that is someone kind of needs to assemble those into a pipeline that achieves something. So if there's, you know, someone that offers transport and someone that offers, you know, a widget, you know, when you put them together, you get a widget delivery to the place that it's needed. So, and I mean, that's just two producers in the network. But essentially you could have now networks, you know, emergently putting together these commitments into chains that produce outcomes that serve the needs of the community. So this is sort of the other side. It's the need broadcast and the availability broadcast. We have this like supply and demand, and I mean it's basically a, you know, needs and offers network that is stigmergic rather than navigated through I know someone who knows someone who needs my help. There's all sorts of kinds of intents. This could be like routing and delivery of goods or services. This might even be like preferred economic routing. Like if I want all of my transactions to settle without touching US dollars. So now that's an intent over the routing path of my transactions. You know, I might say, I don't want anyone associated with the financial industry to be able to purchase my token as delineated by, you know, whatever. So there's like all sorts of intents that we can bake into, I think, our economic and democratic and computational layers of multi-party coordination. We did a bit of exploration at Block Science over the past couple of years on organizational cybernetics. I mean, this is kind of what Block Science does for its clients, but we applied our lens to ourselves internally. This was an interesting blog talking about basically viable systems models, cybernetics from the perspective of Stafford Beer and some of the OG cyberneticists, and then how we can apply those lenses and frameworks to organizational understanding and improvements as especially in like distributed organizations where top-down hierarchy is less likely to you know, impose a reasonable order. It's something that has to emerge functionally. So I think VSM, viable systems models, and cybernetics have some really important lessons for us there. And then of course we can go from the cybernetic to the cybernetic, from autopoiesis to sympoiesis. This was something that was brought up at the Crypto Commons gathering this year. There is really no autopoiesis because there's nothing that acts in isolation to everything else around it, its environment, the other actors in that environment. So thinking about sympoiesis and how we can, you know, take new steps in emergent adaptive collaboration using some really cool new tools. Yeah, so representative democracy, I mean, what we have today could barely be called democracy. It is ossified to the point of being totally illegitimate. We need delegated voting systems. We need proportionality of opinions. We need intensity of preference, not one person, one vote. We need continuous preference signaling, not voting once every 4 years. Like, this is outrageous that we have a 2-bit democracy with a 4-year baud rate. Like, it is not how we do signal processing. And it's probably why things like, you know, fascism erupt, because people cannot affect change in the system, and they get left behind, and they, you know, turn to violence and taking what they need. And this is, you know, we need to increase the signaling capacity of our democratic systems, and mushrooms are the best signal processors that we know of in nature. They're the most adaptive organisms that, and I mean, among other life forms that are quite similar. But these principles that are universal and found in nature, I think we can leverage to give ourselves a head start in catching up to, the life forms that already exist, like capitalism. Microorganizations to my communities. So how do we sense in common? How do we decide collectively? And how do we distribute resources for action? From the individual level, where we want tactical autonomy, I get to decide, how I'm doing what I'm doing. But at the collective level, we have strategic autonomy. What is our goal together? And of course, you can choose to stay in that collective or leave. But essentially, we need to think of how we can sense faster, cohere better, and then act adaptively. And I think with tokens, both as input mechanisms and as output mechanisms, so as votes or as preference signals going in, as weighted aggregation systems in polycentric governance verticals, deciding collectively and then provisioning those funding pathways through splits and streams. I think this is all possible in a way that was not possible prior to the technologies that we have just in the past months, really. This also brings viscosity as a parameter in fluid delegation. This is really exciting because liquid democracy is great. Liquidity in general is great, but the problem can be, like, we can have flash floods of liquidity. What we need is actually fluidity. We need to have managed liquidity. So the viscosity is now a parameter that we can have a dial saying, hey, some of our decisions need to be made fast. Let's turn that viscosity dial down. The votes flow quickly. But some things, like amending our constitution, should be slower. Let's turn that to only changing every few months. So we can now have both over our democratic systems, what decisions change at what times, what funds flow at what rates, what data goes where and when. All of this is possible to deal with in flow dynamics, and that allows us to bring in a lot of the same control systems engineering from circuits, from electrical power grids, or from public works, water grids, all that kind of stuff, into basically economic power grids and democratic power grids, and even computational data systems that exist outside of big tech, truly in the digital public infrastructure domain, running on open protocols. Of course, there are many versions of these, but I think we're looking at an age where we can think beyond these silos and question a lot of our assumptions about how we are currently stuck in our economic, political, and judicial, legal current systems. And that brings us to psychedelics. So how do we create more responsive institutional forms? How can we, at a glance, look at maybe a corporation or a government or a DAO and see your aggregate inflows, your aggregate outflows, what's flowing around, where is it flowing, what is conserved, what is lost, what is working, what isn't, what are the outputs? All of this can be brought into basically like real-time interactive dashboards with nested transclusion. So you can be interacting with smart contracts or models or different websites, different documents. It's almost unimaginable the types of things that are going to be possible with a few of these new tools that are coming, namely, blockchain, Web3 technologies, AI technologies, multiplayer collaborative canvases, stuff like Folk.js, and KOI out of block science. There's just some very, very exciting convergences of technology that I think will open up all sorts of new collective deliberation tools in orgs like Open Civics in the next few months even. So how do we align human and natural systems with MicroFi? We can think of these nested structures. We can think of these things happening at small local level, but also percolating up to higher levels. It's not just about creating coordination within a DAO, it's about allowing DAO meshes to form. How does data flow across DAOs? How does representation flow across DAOs? How do funds flow between DAOs? These are all the same sort of structure that can be managed for different types of flows, as we've talked about. And namely, I'm thinking democratic, economic, and computational, but of course, there can be many versions of each of those. So to close off, the revolution will be mycelial. The revolution has always been mycelial. After every major cataclysm, mycelium are the first to come back. They're the first to prepare the ground for what is to come. Sometimes that looks like a disease to us. We're seeing lots of fungal-based infestations of crops and trees and whatnot, and this is likely because of climate change. Mushrooms are sensing what's coming before all the other life forms, and they're already preparing sort of the ecosystem, the trophic layers of energy, because mushrooms are at that layer 0. And then, plants grow out of the soil, and animals eat the plants, and we eat the animals. So there are all these layers of energy, and mushrooms always find themselves at that really essential layer, right between life and death, actually. So I think our next step is to intentionally compost capitalism. Capitalism is this zombified structure. All of the institutions within it are functioning barely, beyond recognition or their true purpose. So ultimately, what mushrooms offer is the ability to break that down and give it new life into new systems. How do we compost the underutilized and under-recognized resources of these legacy systems and turn it into energy for what is to come? And you can check that out on compostcapitalism.xyz. And I guess that's the end. So thanks very much. And you can find me on a couple of different platforms if you like, a lot more prominently on GitHub. This is probably where I'm really only pushing stuff regularly lately. A couple of mycopunk principles, just to leave you with some thoughts, and a couple of books that you could consider picking up or reading if you want to get more into the mycopunk realm. And I think that's it. So happy to take some questions if anybody has any. Maybe I'll open up the chat too, because there are probably some questions there. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to either put it in the chat or raise your hand, and we'll just go in the order of folks who raise their hands. While people are kind of contemplating their questions, I like to use that opportunity to ask a first question to get things moving and flowing. I am 100% along for this journey with you, Jeff, and I'm curious of what you're tracking maybe in addition to intense ways that we can actually begin to implement these kind of cybernetic structures, whether that be through, I think something like Trust Graph is a really interesting exploration, where suddenly we have this kind of machine readable unit of our relative relational trust in the network. And that can be extended and built out into other tools that utilize those kinds of flows of information. What are the building blocks that you see as kind of already existing, or being maybe the most important to create to enable these kind of cybernetic flows in organizations?
Good question. I think there are so many ways to do it. There's no one way to put it together, and we definitely don't want to. I think the key is composition. We don't want to have to build everything from scratch, and we don't want to have to reinvent any wheels. There's already really great tools, as you mentioned, Trust Graph. And I mean, this is basically leveraging even deeper like principles of systems engineering, which is graphs in general, right? So having data formats that are interoperable to different views, being able to have, I think there's a few important things like local first paradigm, or I mean, this is the ultimate in sort of like decentralized data, is like you own your own data, or you keep it as close to you as you need. And I mean, if it needs to go a layer out to your fog computing home device, or even further to your cloud device, okay. Oh yeah, right. I'm like, how am I typing? Thank you. Patricia's just dropping some notes on my computer while we go. Yeah. So the question for me is, how do we find the parts that work, and then how do we assemble them into a machine that works? Some of the things that I'm most excited about lately is TL Draw. I'm sure you've seen some of the whiteboard canvas stuff. The newer version of that will be coming out is Folk.js. Well, not quite newer version, but vastly simplifying the canvas interface and allowing for this kind of, I think, almost like drag and drop functionality, which I'm really excited about. And there are definitely, this is what Patricia and I have been talking about a lot the past couple of days, is there's so much potential. We really have to kind of start whittling down on what are the things we need to do first. So some of the stuff I've been working on is actually rendering like graphs in the canvas. So you could interact with your Obsidian database, not just in the Obsidian like graph view node, but to actually traverse through it, search it, edit notes while in that graph view mode, and then push it back to your Obsidian vault. So it's not about recreating a data set, it's about pulling in your data sets from where they are, interacting with them in a collaborative, dynamic, real-time environment, and then pushing them back to where they live. So you don't force people to leave the platforms that are working for them. If they like TrustGraph, great. Plug TrustGraph into your system as an oracle, render the graph visually in Canvas, even make it interactable, and then push your whatever new information back to TrustGraph. So I think composition and like open data is a really important consideration of this. And I think it also, like, evolutionarily, that means the compositional apps will win out and the siloed apps will slowly become like evolutionarily unfit for this like new data environment. And I think that's an interesting way that we can kind of like create a better ecosystem for our data that those giant big tech behemoth apps just can't, they don't have the requisite variety to evolve in that open data ecosystem in the same way that our open composable open data systems will be able to interact and adapt.
Thank you, Jeff. I hope that gave folks some time. Great. Exhumed, over to you.
Yeah, good to hear the talk a second time. Genuinely. And I think I might be repeating a question that I asked before, but I suspect, or I'm curious if there's, well, I have a new angle on it. My favorite philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, always recommends, is suspicious of metaphors, and is always recommending that where you find a metaphor, try to break through and push to the other side and turn metaphor into, or turn analogy into alliance. And I think this, like, so the biomimetic stuff in crypto is a really great example. It's like, yeah, again, you've heard me do this shtick. It's like, yeah, it's really interesting and important to think about mycelium as a, to think about economic or cybernetic or systematic analogies to mycelium. But what would it mean to actually develop, relationships of alliance, relationships of economic solidarity with those, and with non-humans, and especially non-humans that are so non-anthropomorphic, or like take shapes and are embodied in types of individuality that don't easily map on to human individuality. And maybe that's the new angle, is like, yeah, I guess maybe that's, I wrap it up like, how do you think about the challenges in these biomimetic extensions? How do you think about the fact that the crypto space, the rhetoric around sovereignty, just the design structures at large are so preoccupied with a kind of individuality, whereas these sort of sympoietic organisms that you're talking about don't have those easy boundaries? And how can those be mapped? How can we be inspired by that in a way that doesn't reduce folks' autonomy or give them a sense of being a part of the Borg, while still opening them up to sort of new surfaces of connection?
I think the answer is stay weird. To people, I don't know, there is so much we have to learn from these organisms. And I think one of them is like, resilience is at the other side of the scale than efficiency. So we have when we're very efficient, we're very brittle. And nature is so resilient. Nature is the most resilient. And I mean, you might look at it and think it's a mess, right? We look at a mycelium and then we look at a microchip and we go, wow, this microchip is so elegantly designed. Look at these buses. Look at these, like, look at this routing. And that mycelial network is just a tangle of things. What the heck? But if you think of that bus, if you cut it, the whole chip is dead. If you cut a mycelium, it only gets stronger and it routes better. So there is no way to stop the mycelium in the same way that we can stop like a human designed chip. One bullet in a human designed chip and it's dead. If you shoot a mycelium, do you think it cares? Like, it's like, you can't kill it. It's anti-fragile. And I think we have this hyper optimization, hyper efficiency outlook that capitalism has put in us, because profit and the extraction of profit has been the sole goal for a long time. And now it's minimization of risk to an extent and minimization of carbon to an extent. But for the most part, it's still just profit. So I think when we have multivariate value systems, because these routing systems can be for any token. So any token that represents anything. And of course, that doesn't mean all of those tokens will be valued. There are websites nobody goes to. There will be currencies nobody uses. But there will be plenty of alternatives that offer better than what we have now. And that's a very, very low bar. So I think when we look around the world, all of these like things where we're like, oh my gosh, that's so terrible. Those are actually really low bars for better systems, better currencies, better decision-making mechanisms. And those opportunities are just everywhere for us to pick up. So I don't know if that answered your question exactly, James, but you are such a deluser, man. You always bring them up.
Well, and just maybe just the word on the question of actual alliance with the mycelium that you speak so well of.
Oh man, well, we've been eating them for they may have had a hand in our evolution, right? We don't know, the stoned ape hypothesis. But I mean, we learn from them. They heal us. There's already this I think, you know, if we don't think of communication in the words and data sense, but man, do 5 grams in darkness in a closed room and you will communicate with the beings. So it's definitely there. And I think it has been for time immemorial. Like we've kind of forgotten this as a society. I think all of our indigenous societies had much deep relationships with indigenous plants of one kind or another, and you know, annual rituals or ceremonies that would involve, you know, collectively doing those, going back to like ancient times. So it's only really modern times that these things have become taboo. You know, the 70s they got turned illegal. And, you know, even before that, there was huge cultural awakenings that were brought about in part by these substances. So I think that communication is, you know, that communing has been a thing for as long as we have. And maybe we can figure out new ways to do that, which is amazing. But also not forgetting the old.
I want to ask a really tight question to tie that up, and then switch over to Stefan, who's raised some stuff in the chat. But I remember recently, I'm looking both directions. I'm going to look at the camera. Recently, someone was challenging me on my use of metaphors in similar ways and leaning on mycelium versus like mycorrhizal and like getting a little bit more specific about the thing that you're pointing to. And I'm wondering, to loop back at the beginning of Exum's question, if you feel that that's like something we should be thinking about, or in that being weird, being messy, that there's, you know, that's good enough.
So good point. There are a few different major kinds of fungi. Mycorrhizal is one, and I think this is like the rhizomatic, the Deleuze and Guattari often talk about. This is what people usually think about when they think of mushrooms. They think of like mycelium underground, the white threads growing through the soil. I mean, if you take a spoonful of soil, this is enough filament to get like to the moon and back. I don't remember exactly, but it's insane how fine and how much there is everywhere. There are many different kinds of fungi, and actually I think they all have things to teach us. And I mean, this doesn't just stop at fungi either. Bacteria have very interesting mechanisms for how they get around in the world and do stuff. Yeasts are incredible as well. They're kind of like modular fungi. They can act like individual cells, but they can also link into a network, and then they can disengage again. So this brings us whole new ways of thinking about like groups or subgroups or DAOs, or how these mechanisms work. We don't know enough, I think. So yeah, I mean, there's so many different mechanisms, and we don't like. The study of mycology is fairly recent. We used to consider this lower plants. It didn't even have its own kingdom. So the study of these organisms needs to be ramped up massively. Toby Kears has some very interesting research on like market dynamics. Like she's observed like Walrasian market dynamics, basically like supply and demand is conserved between mycelium with more of a resource and mycelium with less. They will trade at different rates to trees. So there's all sorts of really interesting dynamics that we can observe and either validate or learn from how we can set up our systems in ways that are beneficial to us and our ecosystems as well, because that's essentially what mushrooms are really good at, not just thinking of themselves. Should we come to a couple of Stefan's questions? These look good.
I don't even know if I have questions. I'm just, maybe I'm pointing stigmergic trails, because I can't even remember the stuff I was working on. This is back in like 2010 and stuff when I was writing my master's thesis.
Nice.
But yeah, like I went down a rabbit hole for a good 2 months reading a bunch of different things, including stuff from Deleuze, but also Isabel Stengers and other folks like this. Yeah, I remember being kind of captivated by this idea of the chemical sign, and then later this year, more so kind of through Brian Masumi's work, beginning to explore a bit more around Charles Sanders Peirce's semiotics, and these different ways of thinking about icon, index, and sign. So like beginning to really pull apart and analytically decompose what are these kind of, I don't know, let's call them like containers of information in systems that use information, which in most cases, well, in all cases is going to be living systems, right? So I think there's something really interesting in thinking about these kind of this phrase, or not even a phrase, this concept from Manuel de Landa's work around non-organic life. So like you have non-organic life, which is these, processes of phase transitions that might happen in systems when a temperature gradient is hit or something like this, right? So you have physical systems going through almost lifelike phase transitions into new forms. But there isn't, there's information in that, but it's not a tremendous amount of information. And it's also heavily governed by entropy. And then you look at living systems and you have these infodynamical systems that are kind of building more complexity in an effort to kind of combat entropy in a way, right? And then in the case of the Earth, we have all of these different kingdoms of life that have created different signaling processes over millions of years of evolutionary history, that I think now, with the support of AI, we're beginning to see the possibility of some kind of Rosetta Stone between life forms on the planet. And I think this is what interests me the most about this work that you're discussing here, is like, in what ways can we begin to understand the grammar and the just the structures of information that might exist in a mycelial system, and how might we, like, it's always going to be based off of our own conceptual biases as humans, right? But how might we begin to create translation layers between these different infodynamical spaces of life forms on the planet? And yeah, I think it's just a very interesting thing to think about and wonder about, and also to even, like, in the truest skeptical sense, like, wonder, is it even actually possible, or are we just still in a hall of mirrors thinking our own thoughts, our own human concerns and things like this, and projecting them onto life forms that are fundamentally maybe always going to be alien to us because we have our fucked up shit going on up here. So I'll leave you with that.
Totally. Yeah. Exit, did you have a comment on what Stefan was saying, or did you just want to get in the queue?
Yeah, no, I don't want to take the call down too much this rabbit hole, but I just want to say that yeah, I have a proposal, like kind of a petition to Earth Species Network and Interspecies Internet. I mean, I'm preparing one to fund an academic, like an academic research project. I'm not, me not being one of the academics, but actual specialists, specifically about biosemiotics and intents, kind of inspired by Masumi and Peirce, just like you're talking about. So, yeah, actually, I would love to share it with you if that's of interest, because I think that intents really break through to being capable of, like, intents can be non-representational. You could set up sensors and have communication that way, and I think in that sense they bridge much further to that possibility for, like, interspecies economy, interspecies political economy. And yeah, that's been a main concern of mine for quite a bit now. So.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't know, Stefan, if you saw that paper that came out in Nature, I think it was last year or the year before. They identified like up to 50 fungal words that are transmitted through networks. I found this article on IFL Science, but I hope there's a Nature article or a Nature paper linked in there. If not, you should be able to Google it. But it is interesting in this more literal communication sense. But I mean, even if we don't crack how to communicate with these beings, I think they will all be very grateful to us if we don't totally destroy the, like, living biosphere on the planet. Like, we can show our gratitude by not destroying their home, not necessarily saying we're not going to destroy your home. Why don't we just do it? I mean, if we could say it too, that would be amazing. But I mean, they're already saying it, so we can, I think there's so much exciting stuff to come. And yeah, mycelium just seemed to be at that bleeding edge, material science, medical, economic, recycling. We can, break down hydrocarbons, oil spills, plastic, cigarette butts. Mushrooms can help us with all of these problems, e-waste, battery technologies. There's so much interesting areas to explore. And then, of course, how do we scale those without relying on VC and fundraising through these sort of outdated capitalist models? I think this is where MycoFi comes in to basically offer the ability to tokenize future outcomes and offer them basically like endogenizing the social impact bond as an economic primitive. I don't know. Well, maybe I'll drop the link here. We wrote a book with Kevin Nowacki and the Green Pill a couple of years ago. And in there, we touch on a topic of endosymbiotic finance. Maybe that's a thought I'll just leave. I don't know how much time we have left, or so the final thought, endosymbiotic finance is like, how do we bring inside the organization the useful functions of finance, so we no longer need our organizations to be on dialysis to a predatory financial system to issue equities, bonds, debt. We can do this through protocols that are open, that are shared, that are understood and in what they do and what they represent. And then we can move into an age of permaculture currencies rather than this monoculture currency with the clear booms and busts that we would expect from any monoculture. So I think, the future is going to be cool, and it's an interesting time to be alive.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me today. It's been fun.